Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I am doing fine. I thought maybe we would revisit once again another one of the hot spots that has been created. And that, of course, is we want to talk about Iran, because the president was very clear on what his position is today and what it is tomorrow. But no, he made a statement that said that he's a cheerleader for those who are demonstrating against the government of Iran. And there's a lot of argument about exactly why, but he is saying at the appropriate time he will lend support to those who are, challenging the government. And of course, we don't know exactly who's doing what and how many, because although there's been some that have demonstrated against the government, there were a lot of people ended up coming out in support of the government, as was reported. But he still says, the time will come, I'm not going to tell you when, but when it's appropriate, we will lend them even more support. My suspicion is, from a little bit of recent history, if we were going to be getting involved, we've been involved a long time ago. I think we know exactly what's going on. I think we have our agents over there. I think the conditions have not changed a whole lot since 1953. And certainly 1953 was the year that Eisenhower and the British, pulled off a coup in Iran. And we've been subsequently doing that in many, many countries over these years. And once again, we're still at it. So this whole idea that all of a sudden we're going to lend support for those who want to get rid of a government that we want to get rid of, and our close allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, they're with us on this, or we're with them, who knows what. But this whole thing is ratchet up a little bit, because it looks like this problem is not going to be solved in the next week or two. It looks like Trump is destined to get America much more involved, even though I say we've already been involved more than we need to be.
It's funny that the Trump, and especially the neocons that unfortunately have surrounded him, they think they know what the protests are all about. We don't really have a full complex view because it's a complex society, but for them, just cut and dry, they want freedom. Just a bumper sticker, they want freedom. But it really was a shockingly stupid move for Trump to say that we're going to help you at the appropriate time. And think back in Budapest, 1956, when U.S. propaganda was blaring in with the same message. We're with you, we're going to back you, overthrow your government, overthrow. Well, they had no intention of doing so. They had no intention of starting a huge war. Probably the case here with Iran. But what does it do? It leads to a lot more people being killed. It leads to false expectations. It leads to a bad outcome. It leads to a crackdown that's happened in Budapest. So it shows that they really have learned nothing from history. If he really means to do that, he probably should have shut up and do something like that. So it's the worst of all worlds.
And I think when it's so blatant, the world already suspect that we're very much involved. But when it's so blatant, what does it do to the really honest people who would like to see reforms? And there are those in Iran that would, and they've moved in that direction. This idea that they're more radical than ever and they're worse than they were in '79. This hurts the people who are trying to move things in a more deliberate fashion. And no matter what they say about the shortcomings of Iran, Iran probably comes closer to a fair election than a lot of other countries. Compared to Saudi Arabia, there's just nothing that you could do to compare Iran with Saudi Arabia and say, oh, well, obviously we're supporting the good guys and the bad, we're supporting the good guys in Saudi Arabia against these bad people in Iran. Of course, that lends itself to why we shouldn't be trying to think that we're, all wise and morally obligated to pick sides and get the American people involved in.
It's funny when there are big protests in places like Bahrain, when the Shia are protesting against the oppressive Sunni government in Bahrain, the U.S. doesn't pay any attention, of course, because we don't want Bahrain overthrown. We want Iran overthrown. But if you look at the protesters and you look at the protests objectively, you have to say it's not a lot of people. It's a country of 80 million people. You've got a few hundred, maybe a few thousand protesting in a country that big. The people did vote. They gave a mandate to Rouhani, who's a reformer. They They took the presidency away from the hardliner, from Ahmadinejad. So they did have a selection between two competing factions with very different views of governing. And there are many counter-protesters, which, as you pointed, in some cases, they're so much bigger than the protests that I was just looking at an AP article, and they were using a pro-government protest and pretending it was an anti-government protest. And you could tell because there were pictures of Khamenei throughout the entire audience. So you have all of these things put together. So by what measure does the U.S. feel it has a legitimate reason to say that then the government should be overthrown? Because a few thousand people come out, they don't like what's happening, probably legitimate reasons. But, you know, we had a bunch of people in Charlottesville a while ago. Does that mean that we should overthrow this government in favor of what they wanted? You know, it's such a bizarre idea that a few thousand people in the street should negate an election.
And of course, we're denied the information or what the plans might be. And of course, that's Trump's style, that we don't want the enemy to know exactly what we're about to do in a military sense. Well, you know, if there's a declared war like World War II, maybe there's room for some secrecy on movement of troops. But that's not what this is all about. This is to deny information to a lot of people, including the American citizens. But it's the American citizens who pay the taxes and send their kids off and end up in wars that last 16 years. And this is what could happen here. It's not going to be a simple job for a military intervention, but what is he thinking about? But does he consult with the Congress and have a discussion? Is there a debate? You know, how hard we used to try to get the debates going over Iraq and Afghanistan, and just getting the debate, you know, the leadership of both parties are like this on these issues, and they'll do anything to keep the debate from coming out, and they're like this when they need the money. Yeah. You know, so it's just such a tragedy on where we are on this, and all this fighting and fuming, and yet you know, there's a lot of support. As much as they hate Trump, and I believe the hatred is real, they are not against you know, getting soft on or supporting these sanctions and these different things, and being really tough, mainly because of the allies that we have there, because that's what we want to have. It has nothing to do with promoting freedom. That is such an insult that we go over to protect, to enhance our liberties and our national security and all this, and we go over there because we care about the Iranian people because they want freedom. This is not the way to do it if they did, but I think that's the least important reason why our government talks about intervening in most of these countries. Do you think it was the freedom for the Ukrainian people that we just, you know, participated in a coup? You know, they don't care about that. If they did, they'd care more about the freedoms here at home instead of having the authoritarians, you know, taking over and violating all our civil liberties. That's what we need to do. But this is tragic. It's a bunch of lies that are told the American people, and then they hide what they're planning to do. So let's hope this thing is a fizzle.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the neocons in the U.S. are furious because the Europeans are not jumping on board, pressuring the Iranian government, trying to overthrow the government. Here's talk about a lineup. Here's John Bolton talking to Steve Bannon today. He said, quote, "Let's bring that regime down." You know, here's Bolton. So irresponsible. Someone like that should be laughed off the stage. But the Europeans are not jumping on board. They're very reticent. Macron, the French president, said yesterday that the official line pursued by the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, who are all allies in many ways, is almost one that would lead to war. And he's saying, let's talk to Iran. Let's not try to, you know, foment this thing into a war.
And this whole idea about where the Europeans are going to stand versus the United States versus Iran is coming up, at least theoretically is coming up. The nuclear treaty with Iran came up in 2015, and it was to pass sanctions, you know, to get rid of the sanctions. And this was a big deal, and they have followed the rules. IAEA has given them a clean bill that they've done exactly what they were supposed to do. But, you know, instead of getting rid of the sanctions, they kept the sanctions on the book, but they didn't enforce them. And that's not Trump alone. That's what Obama did. Oh, just in case, we got to satisfy the neocons because we may need it. And Trump has done the same thing. But there's always a deadline, and it looks like there's a deadline, you know, and on the 13th of this month that Trump has to make a decision, you know, on reimposing these sanctions. But that blows the whole thing up. of the few things we were able to recognize as a correct movement under Obama was at least, talking to the Iranians and getting them to, agree not to develop a nuclear weapon. But this is undoing this. This is going backward for no good reason whatsoever. But it may turn out that next week might be an important week for this, and Trump will be challenged on what he's going to do. And once again, you brought up the subject about the Europeans. That the Europeans, when Trump was vacillating on certification, which is a slightly different issue, the Europeans said, no, we want to keep trading. This time they're sort of quiet. So it's interesting to postulate just what does it mean by the Europeans are sort of quiet, and yet next week there may be a major decision made on sanctions.
And it's awfully convenient, let's put it that way. It's awfully convenient that Trump was out there in October when he refused to recertify. He was out there because Iran had just been certified by the IAEA. Our European partners are very happily trading with Iran. Their trading is skyrocketing. And so he's very much out on a limb. He's trying to demonize Iran, but by all measure, Iran is behaving itself quite well. Now, all of a sudden, a week before these new sanctions, or the sanctions would kick in unless he waives them, all of a sudden there's unrest in Iran and an uprising, apparent uprising, and Trump is talking about more sanctions. I don't know about conspiracies, but it smells a little funny to me.
Well, my first thought is that the Europeans are playing it cautiously, and not coming out and condemning Trump or agreeing with him, because I do think they want trade. So they're sitting back. I think that's a sign that maybe the U.S. credibility with the current president has actually gone down. Maybe they stand back a little bit. Maybe they can, maybe they will in no way. Maybe they'll go on their own and say that, we're going to treat them this way, and we're going to keep trading, and we're going to fulfill the treaty in hopes that the Iranians don't start building nuclear weapons again. And that would be a big setback for U.S. Diplomatic relationships and credibility around the world. But I think that would be tried first, and if it doesn't work, and Trump gets the upper end, and there's chaos and really some a lot more violence there, I think this will just push the Iranians. Why wouldn't they, who already talk to the Chinese and the Russians, why wouldn't that just push them more into that corner? And that might be their second option. So the best option would be for Trump to back off, and the next one would be for the Europeans to be independent-minded and not be coerced by our government.
Well, in that case, the neocons will be batting 1,000, because every policy that's pursued that the neocons are in favor of has the opposite outcome. Iraq benefited Iran, Syria benefited Iran, so they'd be batting 1,000 if that were the case. But ironically, if on the 13th Trump does not waive the sanctions yet again, it would be the U.S. that would be in material breach of the agreement, of the Iran sanctions agreement. So a little bit ironic that we're the only ones that actually are in real breach.
That's right, and they'll play that up. And also that once we do this, the economic conditions which are deteriorating in Iran, we'll get all the blame, just like it was in Cuba. We put on the sanctions and we do this, and it will never be the enemy, the government, and blame the government for everything. So this will be less blame for the government that they're trying to get rid of. Once again, doing the opposite of what they think they're going to do.
Yeah, it's funny to watch the neocons. Always wrong, but always right. I guess my last word would be, this is the real danger. Trump is believing the neocon lies that are around him. They're telling him, they're whispering in his ear, hey, Tehran is about to fall. We're going to get our regime change. We're this close. Just push it a little more. That is not the case. They're not close to regime change right now. They're not close to overthrowing the government. And the only thing that will happen if Trump continues to listen to these neocon liars is a lot more death and destruction.
Yes, and we can't cheer the fact that we have somebody representing our country at the United Nations to come up with a sensible approach and a little bit of diplomacy, because Nikki Haley is not going to be helpful. She will stir the pot, and she will prod Trump on, and he's liable to do the wrong thing once again when it comes to relations. But this is the one place where we've given Trump credit because he's been more consistent in his antagonism and his despising of the Iranian government than he is on the other issues. He's really been consistent. He started in the campaign. He has stuck with this, and unfortunately, it's going to be difficult to shake him loose. Only some practical things will have to happen. It may be this shaking loose. Maybe the Europeans won't be quite so willing to go along with the United States, because it's in tremendous benefit to the Europeans to trade, with the Iranians. And yes, we've been trying for a lot of years, especially since 1953, to own Iran and control their oil and benefit from it. But it looks like that battle is going to go on. And right now, I think we're operating from a weaker hand. So this would be a good time for a reassessment. New Year's here. Why don't they reassess and say, you know what? Those guys that talk about non-interventionism at that Institute for Peace and Prosperity, maybe we ought to try that. I hear it's worked once in a while. Of course it works. They should do it. And they should forget about, all this conspiracy on how we're going to control the world and the natural resources, and teach other people how to live. And we'll do it all in the name of peace and civil liberties for the victims of our policies. It's time for a change to a new policy, non-interventionism. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.